Okay, guys, so I believe this is week 6 of the weekly sonneteer. And this week, I've decided to go with one of my own sonnets, okay? So, it, yeah. Yeah, that's it. I write sonnets, and I just thought I would talk about one of mine today. I like practicing the sonnet form for all of the reasons that I've discussed in previous sonnet talks. I also find that it's one of those things that it's good practice because obviously there are a lot longer poems, both in the modern form, kind of the free verse, trying to do uh, trying to get away from rhyme and meter, and also in traditional verse. I mean, obviously, I guess to put it simply, it's not a very intellectual way to put it, but it's just there's a lot longer poems and stuff. But given the pressures of society and of the day and of family life and of work and all the things around one, I like the sonnet because it's not a massive undertaking, but it is still, it's taking the time to sit down and put your thoughts together in an artistic fashion. And then you can get up and as little time as you may have in a day, you've had some time to reflect. And of course, it's one of those things. I mean, it takes a lot of tweaking to make a sonnet really work well, as it would with any other poem. What you put into something is what ultimately others will be able to get out of it. And so it's not that a sonnet takes less time to develop and hone per square inch per line, right? But it's still a more compact thing, than, for example, setting out to write a short story or a book in verse or something like that, right? Okay, so one little note before I get started on this sonnet of mine here. As I was looking back after the talk that I did on the in on the sonnet ballad. So the last week's poem that we looked at, it struck me that as I was reading it, as I was talking about it, I said this is an Italian sonnet because you've got these two sections. You've got an octet at the beginning, the 8 lines, and a sestet, the 6 lines at the end. And thank you. I won't mention the student, but thank you for reminding me that those actually have names. It's not just the 8 line section and the 6 line section. It's an octet and a sestet, right? So thanks for reminding me of that. But I my gut instinct was to label that as an Italian sonnet because there it was, octet sestet, with Gwendolyn Brooks's sonnet ballad that we looked at last week. But as I was looking back on it, I was like, well, it has the rhyme scheme of a Shakespearean because you have that A B A B C D C D E F E F G G, that rhyme scheme like that. And again, I don't know if we've talked about rhyme schemes like that yet, but the first time a rhyme is introduced, if you're trying to figure out the meter of a poem, the rhyme scheme of a poem, it would be A, right? And then the next time another rhyme is introduced, B. And then every time you come back around to one of the rhymes you've already used, you use the same letter. So a Shakespearean rhyme scheme would be like A B A B C D C D E F E F, and then the last couplet, the last 2 lines would introduce a new rhyme, so those would be G G, if that makes sense. But so as I was looking at that last poem we did last week, I was like, oh, this does have it's got the octet, the 8 lines, and the sestet, the 6 lines, so it's split up like an Italian sonnet, but it's also got that rhyme scheme the three quartets, the three sets of four lines which rhyme within themselves, and the last couplet which rhymes within itself, and that's the Shakespearean sonnet. So it is definitely possible to mix the two forms together, the Italian and the Shakespearean. All right, so all that said, let me go to this sonnet that I've written that I'm going to talk about here. So this, and again, I've got a link to it, to a Word doc with the sonnet down below if you want to look at that. But the poem is called The Groomsman, and it makes reference to Luke chapter 14, verses 7 through 11 in the Bible, but I'll come back to that later. First, I'll just read the poem for you. So, The Groomsman. I hold this photo of my wedding feast, you seated at my bride's request at my left hand, so that amid our relatives you'll feel yourself less like a misplaced beast. The one groomsman not of my family, arm linked with my kid sister, you walk down the aisle, now voicing your discomfort at your place of honor mid our panoply. Until I mention how, in Luke, the Lord advised his listeners to take the lowest seats as dinner guests and not the best, so that they might be noticed at the board by hosts who'd usher them up from below, as you've been honored here among the rest. All right, so as looking at this, I want to read this Bible passage to you here that the poem references, Luke chapter 14 to 7 verses 7 through 11. So this is where Jesus is at a dinner party with a bunch of Pharisees, a bunch of religious leaders, and maybe some of the political leaders of Israel, right? So he's at a dinner party, and they've invited him there because they're trying to fill him out. Really, they're trying to get him in trouble or something. So they invited him over for dinner. But let me just read this passage to you. So this is Jesus teaching a bit as he's at this dinner party with all these rich people and political and religious leaders. Verse 7, and he began speaking a parable to the invited guests. A parable is a story. He began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they had been picking out the best places, when he noticed that they had been picking out the places of honor at the table, saying to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor. For someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by the host. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this man. And then in disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So basically, Jesus has just been noticing this tradition in Eastern cultures, I guess, and especially in Jewish culture at this time, that when people are invited to a dinner party, to a wedding or whatever, they would try. Some seats were more honored than other seats. So some seats were like closer to the bride and groom, or the better seats, and so people would try and grab those seats because they knew if they were sitting in those seats, people would realize how special they were. But the problem was, and Jesus is talking to them, and he says, you know what, when you show up to one of these feasts, don't try and grab the best seats. Instead, take the lowest seat. And he explains, he says, the host did have the prerogative. If the host, a friend of theirs, walked in, or somebody they wanted to be the special guest, they could take them up to the head of the table, and if you were sitting there, they might be like, dude, please get up, because this person today has more honor than you, and then you're like embarrassed and humiliated because you got to go down to the worst spot because that's all that's left, right? And so Jesus is like, when you come to a dinner party, don't try to put yourself first. Don't fight for those best seats. He's like, sit down at the lowest spot. And then, you might get honored. The host might come and be like, why are you sitting down here? And the host moves you up to a better seat. And then you're not looked down on by everybody. Instead, you're honored by everybody because it's not the host moving you down, it's the host moving you up to a better seat. That last verse where Jesus says, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. The person who tries to put themselves at the best seat will be humbled, will be in a sense disgraced. But the person who is willing to be humbled will be exalted, but by God in this context. And so this poem is kind of referencing that as a way to talk about my own wedding, which was back in 2009. I got married. And so this poem is about something that happened at my wedding with my groomsmen. But I'm also referencing this passage from Jesus. So let me I'll read the poem again, and then I'll talk specifically about the poem. The groomsman. I hold this photo of my wedding feast, you seated at my bride's request at my left hand, so that amid our relatives you'll feel yourself less like a misplaced beast. The one groomsman not of my family, arm linked with my kid sister, you walk down the aisle, now voicing your discomfort at your place of honor amid our panoply. Until I mention how, in Luke, the Lord advised his listeners to take the lowest seats as dinner guests and not the best, so that they might be noticed at the board by hosts who'd usher them up from below, as you've been honored here among the rest. So I'll just go through and pick this poem apart for you. I'm literally looking at a photograph as I'm thinking about this poem, as I'm, working over this poem. You seated at my bride's request at my left hand, so that amid our relatives you'll feel yourself less like a misplaced beast. So it was, my best friend at the time. He was at the wedding, and my wife, her father had asked to throw a dinner party for us after we got married. And so we were like, sure. So at this dinner party with all my family, my cousins, really everybody else was a family member. My best friend is here at this dinner, and he's the one person who's not related to me, right? And my wife, feeling like, she wants him, for one thing, because we're the only two who know each other, right? But she doesn't want him to feel too out of place or anything, and so she says, why not let him sit at your left hand? Because, of course, my wife, is at my right hand, but she, checks with, she's like, let's let him sit at your left hand, and it's kind of a place of honor at the groom's left hand, or at the bride's right hand, so to speak. And so my friend is sitting next to me, and he, and kind of to make him feel not as out of place, right? Or as I put it, to make him feel less like a misplaced beast. I remember when I was reading this, oddly, strangely enough, that I had in mind, partly feast and beast, like why do I call him a misplaced beast? Well, partly because it rhymes, so that's that's one of those things of writing poetry, just insider's note. Sometimes a word is there just because you're trying to make it rhyme, and so maybe it sounds a little awkward, or maybe it works perfectly for you. I'd be interested in what you think. Does it work to refer to my friend, here, the only one, a non-relative, as like a misplaced beast, like kind of, but that's, partly that's also there because it rhymes with feast. And it's weird because as I was writing this, I was thinking of The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, where they eat roast beast for dinner, I've always loved that term, a roast beast. It doesn't tell you what kind of beast, it just says it's a roast beast. But yeah, so he's the misplaced beast at the dinner. The one groomsman not of my family. Arm linked with my kid sister, you walk down the aisle, now voicing your discomfort at your place of honor mid our panoply. So he did, walking down the aisle and back. He was, yeah. Again, I remember him telling me he just felt kind of awkward when he realized he got to the rehearsal, for example, and realized that my dad and my brothers were the other groomsmen, and my wife's sisters and one or two of my sisters were the other bridesmaids, and he was the only non-family member on the stage, So he was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But I was like, it's all right, dude. So he ends up, he walks down the aisle with my kid sister, who's the youngest of my six siblings. I'm the oldest, of course. And, so it's just one of those moments, right? One of those memories, seeing him walk up and down the aisle with my kid sister. Now, voicing your discomfort at your place of honor mid our panoply. A panoply is like this rich parade. It's kind of like a parade, like a display of glory. And so, as I'm writing this, I'm thinking all of us gathered together in this room for this celebration. This semi-fancy restaurant, right? And so it's like a panoply of people. This display, this royal parade, or whatever. So your place of honor, he's got a position of honor. He's at the groom's left hand in the midst of this panoply. And why do I say mid instead of midst? Or instead of amid? Amid means in the middle of. Amid or amidst means in the middle of. But why do I just put mid? Because of the iambic pentameter. Your place of honor mid our panoply. Okay? And this all, sticks to that iambic pentameter, the whole point. And then so that's your octet, the first 8 lines there, and we're working with an Italian sonnet here of sorts. And then I move into the next major part of the sonnet, right? Until I mention how, and so he's feeling kind of uncomfortable and stuff in the mix, and especially sitting at my left hand when it's like my dad could be sitting there, one of my brothers could be sitting there, but he's there, and he's like, oh, this feels kind of awkward, and we're kind of having this little whispered conversation. I'm like, dude, you know what? And I just kind of mentioned into his ear this story that we would both know about. I say, until I mentioned to him, kind of whispering, until I mentioned how in Luke, the Lord advised his listeners to take the lowest seats as dinner guests and not the best, so that they might be noticed at the board by hosts who'd usher them up from below, as you've been honored here among the rest. And so I'm telling him, remember that story, and it's like, you have been given this place of honor. You've been brought here by the host, by my wife and I. And so this has biblical precedent. Don't be shy about being here. Don't feel awkward about being here. There's biblical precedent to your being here, right? To being noticed at the board. The board means like a board is just another word for a dining table, right? That's what people used to call the table where they would sit down to eat. They call it the board. If you get room and board at a hotel or a bed and breakfast, room and board means you get a place to sleep and you get a meal. So that they might be noticed at the board by hosts who would usher them up from below. Just like you've been honored here among all these people. You've been given honor, right? And so that's the poem. And again, mid-sonnet, it switches from just talking about the circumstances where we're sitting to the metaphor or the simile, as you want to call it. That 6-line simile where I compare the biblical passage to the setting that we're in right there at that dinner after my wedding. Going back over at some stylistic things. Of course, there's the feast, beast, family, panoply, lord, board, and then you'll notice the second and third lines and the 5th and 6th lines do not rhyme. I just wasn't rhyming it, which isn't in line with the most traditional sonnet structures where the whole thing rhymes, but a lot of modern sonnets, people don't rhyme at all. So I'm kind of playing with it. I rhyme the first and fourth, the fifth and eighth, the ninth and 12th lines, and the 13th and 14th. Well, no. There's some rhyme there, but not all of it. Now, let's go to those last 6 lines, because I kind of mess around a little bit with this, working out my rhyme scheme there. Lord and board, right? Lowest and best. And then, so advised his listeners to take the lowest. Originally, I had advised his listeners to take the low and then a dash, and then the ist went down to the next line, so that low, the low, and below would rhyme, which that works. It's okay. Between low and ist, there's a natural syllable break, so it's okay to put a line there. But a friend was talking with me, and they were like, from a contemporary poetry perspective, modern poetry, people don't care that much about poetic structure. It's not a big deal that the rhyme, so they were like, it just looks more natural to have lowest without a dash in the division between 2 lines. And so they were like, from a contemporary modern perspective, just put it together, And interestingly, when that happens, you have lowest, best, and rest rhyming. And then your below is kind of left hanging out there. But you get the idea. So I wasn't being super strict with that, and when a friend was like, what, modern readers won't want to see that lowest split up, I was like, I'll just put it together then. But so you kind of see the rhyme scheme playing through there. A few other things that I noticed as I'm reading this, that it's hard, like I wrote this poem probably 6 or 7 years ago, and so it's hard to remember some of what went through my mind as I was writing the poem stylistically. But a few things as I'm noticing it that may have been intentional, especially as I went back and did revisions of the poem, like editing, because it usually takes me 3 or 4 days with a sonnet, for example, of constantly going back and looking at it again to really get it sounding like I want it to sound stylistically. And so some things in here that may have been intentional that I worked out stylistically. Let me look back over it. I hold this photo of my wedding feast. You see that my bride's request in my left hand, so that you'll feel yourself less like a misplaced beast. Those S and L sounds together. Less like a misplaced, C is an S there, beast. So that line, I probably did go back and work on that stylistically a bit. Less like a misplaced beast. And just working for repetitive sounds to kind of make a poem to get more of the aesthetic feel going on, right? The one groomsman, not of my family. The M's there, groomsman, not of my family. I probably went back and worked on that to get that line just right. Arm linked with my kid sister, you walk down the aisle, now voicing your discomfort at your place of honor mid our panoply, until I mention how in Luke the Lord advised his listeners to take the lowest seats as dinner guests, and not the best. And so guests and S, the lowest, guests, best, kind of like a triple rhyme there. Guest is kind of like a rhyme in the middle of a sentence that connects with lowest and best. And so just a few things looking through it that I'm guessing, when I originally wrote the poem, it may have not have sounded like that, but going back and tweaking it to get some, some sound repetition and stuff going on in the poem. All right, that's what I've got for you today.